27 years of marriage, yet the silence left behind by their lost intimacy had become louder than ever. Divorce was never considered. They stayed, but somewhere along the way, silence became comfortable. On their 27th wedding anniversary, there were no gifts, no plans, no celebration. Just two people who had spent nearly 3 decades together and had somehow arrived at the same painful place. We are just here. But how does a marriage survive for 27 years while the relationship inside it slowly disappears? This is the story of a man looking back at a marriage that had lasted almost 3 decades. He says he loved his wife deeply, so deeply that for years he expected she would eventually love him in the same way. But somehow along the journey, he began to feel like he was carrying more of the relationship than she was. Then something even more significant happened. Their intimacy disappeared. According to his account, after their last child, physical intimacy between them eventually stopped altogether. Not for a few weeks, not for a difficult season. It became part of the marriage, or rather, part of the absence inside the marriage. They tried counseling. They simply didn't ignore the problem. They sought help. And the counselor apparently encouraged his wife to work on herself or considered whether divorce was necessary. But divorce wasn't what either of them wanted. So they stayed married. 27 years. Children. A shared history. A life built together. And yet, the relationship remained stuck. There was no dramatic ending, no divorce papers, no grand confrontation. Just, we are just here. And perhaps that's a part of this story that deserves our attention. Because sometimes the most serious problems in a marriage aren't the ones that end it. They are the ones that become normal. It's easy to hear a story like this and immediately focus on the lack of intimacy. And yes, that is significant. But if we make intimacy the entire story, we may miss the bigger question. Because physical intimacy rarely exists in isolation from the rest of the relationship. There are emotional links, there are expectations, there is affection, there is communication, there is resentment, there is friendship, there is feeling desired, there is feeling understood, there is feeling chosen. So when intimacy disappears, one of the questions worth asking isn't simply, why are they having sex? It is, what happened to the relationship before intimacy disappeared? And that's an important distinction. Because sometimes the bedroom isn't where the relationship began to die. It is simply where the absence became impossible to ignore. It is rarely happens in one dramatic moment. A marriage can become emotionally distant through years of small disappointment. Maybe one person expects something that the other person never fully understands. Maybe someone keeps giving and eventually feels unappreciated. Maybe one partner feels neglected. Maybe the other feels criticized. Maybe conversations become arguments. Maybe arguments become silence. And eventually, silence becomes easier. That's where expectation can become dangerous. One partner thinks, if you really loved me, you would know what I need. The other thinks, why can't you just tell me what you want? Neither person necessarily intends to hurt the other, but the distance grows. Then disappointment becomes resentment. Resentment makes vulnerability harder. Vulnerability becomes rare, and communication starts becoming functional. Who needs to do what? What needs to be paid? Where are the children? What happened at work? What's for dinner? The marriage continues to function, but the relationship begins to disappear underneath the functioning. And eventually, Two people can become very good at running a household together without knowing how to be a couple together. That's when you get something like, we are just here. The story we have comes from the husband's perspective. We don't know exactly how his wife experienced those 27 years, and that matters. Because when one spouse says, I loved her more, we shouldn't automatically conclude she didn't love him. Those are not the same thing. Perhaps she experienced the marriage differently. Perhaps she had her own disappointments. Perhaps there were needs she felt were never understood. Perhaps both people gradually developed different ideas about what love should look like. We don't know. And that's precisely why relationship problems require something more useful than assigning blame. They require curiosity. Instead of asking, who is the bad person? Sometimes the better question is, what happened between these two people? Because marriage doesn't become emotionally empty in a vacuum. Something happened. Sometimes it was obvious. Sometimes it was years of things that seemed too small to matter until they accumulated. This is where the story stops being about a couple you have met and becomes uncomfortable. Ask yourself, when was the last time you and your partner had a conversation that wasn't about responsibilities? When was the last time you talked about your dreams, your fears, your disappointments, your hopes? When was the last time you asked, how are we doing? Not how are you? Not did you eat? Not are you coming home? But how are we? And more importantly, when was the last time you actually listened to the answer? Because some couples stop fighting and think they finally found peace. But sometimes they've simply become tired. Sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes it is resignation. And that's why there is a question I want you to sit with. If you remove the children, the bills, the house, the responsibilities and everything else that force two people to function together, would there still be a relationship underneath it all? Would you still sit together, talk, laugh, touch, learn about each other, make plans? Or would you realize that the only thing keeping the relationship moving is the life you have built around it? That question can be uncomfortable, but discomfort can sometimes reveal what routine has hidden. Here's the hopeful part. A marriage reaching this point does not automatically mean it's beyond repair. But staying married isn't the same thing as repairing a marriage. That's an important distinction. If both people genuinely want the relationship to become alive again, the first step may be acknowledging what has been lost. Not pretending, not minimizing, not saying, at least we are still together, but asking, what happened to us? Then comes another difficult question. Do we both actually want to rebuild this? Because one person cannot single-handedly restore emotional intimacy. You can invite, you can listen, you can change your own behavior, you can become more emotionally available, you can seek professional help, but you cannot force another person to reconnect. And when a relationship has accumulated years of resentment, silence, unresolved hurts, sometimes professional guidance can help a couple have conversations they have been unable to have alone. The goal isn't simply to remain married. The goal is to find out whether the two people inside the marriage can become partners again. Think about those 4 words. We are just here. It could mean we don't want a divorce. It could mean we don't know how to reconnect. It could mean we have been like this for so long that we don't know anything else. It could mean we are tired. Or perhaps we have confused staying together with being together. And that's the distinction I want you to remember. Because a marriage can survive without intimacy. It can survive without romance. It can survive through difficult seasons. But if two people stop being curious about each other, stop listening, stop reaching, stop trying to understand, then eventually the marriage may remain standing while the relationship itself quietly disappears. 27 years is a long time, but time alone doesn't create intimacy. Sharing a home doesn't automatically create connection. Having children doesn't automatically create partnership. And staying married doesn't necessarily mean the marriage is healthy. Sometimes the more important question isn't, are we still married? It is, are we still choosing each other? Because relationship doesn't always end with a slam door. Sometimes they fade quietly. A conversation becomes less important. A touch becomes less natural. A question goes unasked. A disappointment goes unresolved. And eventually, two people who once choose each other every day find themselves simply existing beside each other. Still married, still together, but just there. And if you are wondering whether your own relationship has already entered that kind of emotional distance, there are signs you shouldn't ignore. In the next video, we are going to look at 7 signs that you and your partner may already be emotionally disconnected. Because recognizing the distance early may give you a chance to do something about it.